Uh, the topic for my today's presentation is quite a handful. I should have made it brief, but anyway, it's called Erotic, Hateful, and Seditious, Proscription of Pleasurable, Communal, and Communist Writing in Hindi Print. Now, I am no expert on proscribed literature. I have not really seriously worked on this topic, so I was quite hesitant to be a part of this conference, which has such, great people speaking who have such scholars who have worked, for the last 20 or 30 years on proscribed literature. So I do this kind of a very preliminary presentation with a lot of hesitancy, and I thank the organizers, particularly Ashutosh and Ravikant, for making me a part of this very exciting conference. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take fragmentary examples from my work and show how there were proscriptions of pleasure, communism, and hate writing in the Hindi print public sphere. Now, as Ravikant said, in the beginning, that there are very different ways in which we can see proscription or censorship or banning or what is perceived as objectionable in particular historical contexts. And I want to take this wider definition. So for me, what is interesting is not only what is proscribed, but also the debates that go around what should be proscribed, or for example, what is considered objectionable. And equally interesting it is what escapes these clutches, what escapes these kinds of domination from above regarding proscription. So we know that censorship is differently constituted, in various historical periods and in different geographical sites, in print and visual cultures. And I think what is significant about censorship is that in many ways, its very imposition opens gateways for subversions and transgressions. So, in the histories of censorships and proscriptions, for me, it is important to see the shifts and displacements, that occur with the coming of colonialism, modernity, and mass print vernacular cultures. Why are there so much increasing panics in this period regarding that certain things should be officially banned, censored? So what we see is that proscription and censorship spread out widely and unevenly in this period. And while there were very broad tools for its implementation, it was definitely not homogeneous. So while, of course, modernity and new technologies of surveillance strengthened censorship, there were other ways and avenues in precisely this period that allowed for its puncturing. And I think the vernacular particularly opened up a range of possibilities, and this conference particularly focuses on Hindi and Urdu literature, which for convenience sake, I'm using the term vernacular, which of course can be problematic for lots of scholars, and we can discuss why I'm using this term. So, but I do think that the use of vernacular opened up a range of possibilities, because I do think, as scholars have shown, that, the vernacular offers us a discursive space which is less alienated from the popular. And also that vernacular critical thought was often more original and intransigent towards Western reasoning, and that it was often marked by innovative transactions with local and cosmopolitan idioms and languages of earlier and newer epochs. So, in the context of, I think, colonial history of censorship, the vernacular particularly offers not just a counter record, but it also helps in, making room, I think, for a more, robust literary history of articulation of freedom. Um, vernacular material sometimes received, colonial patronage, but they were often outside its gaze, and they created their own social and cultural world. And in spite of wavering, support, these kind of publications really thrived in colonial India, and they were sustained by this, amazing growth of publishing houses and presses, and a rise of distinct vernacular publics. So, and what is particularly interesting about the vernacular is that the way in which they used local idioms, symbols, and languages in innovative ways, sometimes to escape, colonial kind of censorship. And what has happened is that when we talk of proscription, the biggest focus, and that should be the case when, particularly when we are discussing colonial times, is on, banning of publications that were cast in nationalist colors, which were most prominently brought under surveillance by the British government. But as we know that this was not the only arena where proscription worked. We also know that proscription was carried on, of course, by the state, but there were explicit and implicit, formal and informal censorships, by dominant castes, classes, races, majority religious communities, indigenous elites, public pressure groups, and patriarchies. So, it is, as I said, it is not, it is not just important to look at the formal proscriptions, but also those that were informally promoted, not only by the Britishers, but by the indigenous elites and Hindu middle classes, and which were classified either as obscene or hateful or seditious. So in some ways, this also throws light on the complex and contradictory positions that the colonial state and indigenous constituencies took in censoring publications, because in certain cases we see them standing together. So it is not just the colonial state, that is proscribing or pushing for proscription, but there are indigenous elites as well, who are asking for certain kinds of proscription, banning, or pushing for it. So, and of course, an equally fascinating story of what escaped the clutches. So let me first take the issue of pleasure. So what we see is that, there was, of course, a propagation of disciplinary regimes in this period, because of rise of literacy, spread of print, and there was an intensification in the management and policing of sexuality, love, pleasure in the modern period. And riding on this wave of overwhelming ideal of puritanical Victorian morality and chastity, the everyday pleasures and enjoyments of the colonized, whether it is a festival of Holi, or singing of marriage songs, or courtesans, or fairs, or watching Nautanki, or poetic descriptions of the female body, or erotic representations of non-normative sexualities. These all came to be increasingly depicted by a section of the Britishers and a section of Indian elites and aspiring Hindu middle classes as breeding grounds for a spectrum of imagined vices and as loci of decadence, and which were used in the rhetoric of an evangelical civilizing mission on the one hand, and the serious business of nationalism of the other. So there is this kind of moral panic that we see among Britishers and among a section of Hindu middle classes, where disciplining of pleasure gets much more institutionalized, and it was also reflected in its proscription. Now, in my earlier work, I've shown, how these kind of sections 292, 293, 294 of the Indian Penal Code were explicitly designed, for the prevention of any form of obscenity, and it formally emerged as a category of regulation. So various laws were defined and implemented, to include any kind of visual or written material that was lascivious or appealed to the prurient interest, or which had the effect of depraving or corrupting persons exposed to it. That's how it was described. But in spite of various regulations, as I've noted before, the term obscenity remained really vague. It was not only used to attack pornography, but as we define today, but also to outlaw law publications, on birth control, on family, on other, on even on conjugality, etc. So what we see is, in Hindi, if you look at the Hindi literature, we see, how there are these kind of anxieties, around, what is perceived as obscene. So, for example, when in Telugu, for example, when the Telugu epic, and Susie Tharu have talked about this, that when this Telugu epic, Radhika Santwanam, was republished, in 1911, which was an erotic Telugu epic. The British, with an overwhelming support actually of social reformers, banned it and critiqued the republication of Radhika Santwanam. And this, we can see, was mirrored in many of the Hindi publications as well. So, I'll just I try to share a PowerPoint with you at this point of time. Let me see if this works or not. Just give me 1 minute. Can you see this? Anandita, is it visible?
Very much so. It's
okay,
great.
Fine. Okay, fine. So, so what we see is that So what we see is that, Mahavir Prasad Dwivedi, one of the leading ideologues of the time, and also, editor of the famous Saraswati, was constantly asking for, a banning or a proscription of, these kinds of publications, which were, around Shringar and particularly Ritikal poetry, because of its so-called dirty and sinful portrayal of women lovers, and constantly was asking that such, books, such poetry, such, they should be completely banned. And of course, Sumitra Nandan Pant, too, endorsed this kind of, banning of this poetry by saying, how this, attacking this kind of sensual and gaudy descriptions of women and juxtaposing it to this devoted and chaste Hindu wife. So, in some ways in this process, the joyous figure of Radha actually, quite disappears from the canonized kind of Hindi poetry and Hindi literary syllabi and normative poetry. But at the same time, as I have, earlier shown in my work, is that there was, a lot of other kinds of, material available in Hindi, which brought sexual pleasures and popular mass entertainment, and facilitated the production of so-called dirty and ashleel books, advertisements of aphrodisiacs, etc., as a commodity. And these kind of obscene, so perceived obscene popular print cultures in Hindi, of course, created anxieties both among the British officials and Hindu moralists. This is, of course, not the focus, and because of this, because sedition is the main focus, and that is why many of these publications actually escaped these kinds of proscription and banning, but there were some interventions, and these were aided by the Hindu literati, where orders were passed for prevention of objectionable literature, obscene literature at railway platforms. There was confiscation of sexually explicit material in the form of books, postcards, pamphlets, magazines, and also certain presses were proscribed, because for promoting obscenity, at this time, bookstores were searched for licentious and sexually explicit material. There were warnings, to various book depots not to keep any versions of Kama Sutra. There was this Association for Moral and Social Hygiene, founded, initially in England by Josephine Butler, which was especially active, in asking for proscriptions of materials that were perceived as obscene. And what we see is that how women reformers and AIWC, Gandhi, and many nationalists also regularly appeal to the government to immediately ban and impose rigid censorship against what they saw as obscene books and advertisements. So these objections, I think, drew subjective lines between supposedly legitimate erotic material and obscenity, semi-pornographic books, what can be termed as pornographic, and they clubbed sexism with sexually explicit representations, and they collapsed consensual and coercive sex. There was also this ban, which lots of authors have written about. I'm just going to very quickly talk about it, where Ugs, Pandey Bechen Sharma, Ugs, Hindi collection of stories, which was on homosexuality and sodomy, which was titled Chocolate, and it was published in 1927, was actually banned, and it was only republished again in 1951. So this book is interesting because, it comes out at a time when these ideals of companionate, monogamous, and heterosexual relationships are being strengthened in diverse ways. And while, these kind of apparent dangers of same-sex attractions were reflected, already in Section 377, which was imposed by the British government, amidst this kind of context comes out Chocolate, which has stories like Hey Kumar, Vyabhichari Pyar, Kamariya Nagan Sibal Khai. And though supposedly against homosexuality, these stories are written in a titillating style. They recognize the wide prevalence of such desires. They show gardens, jails, colleges, and libraries, modern sites, of homosexual pleasure in colonial North India, and they absorb elements of public parade and private desire. So what happened was there was this huge campaign called Swadhintaandolan, and which was led actually by a section of Hindi literati and headed by Banarsi Das Chaturvedi. And it was not just a book like Chocolate, but even a book like Ablaon Ka Insaf, which was actually a trenchant critique of patriarchy, again written in a sensational style, which suffered this fate of being banned, on charges of obscenity. So, but I think in spite of these kinds of proscriptions and banning, there was a theater of the local and the vernacular, which became central to texts of, texts of sex, love, and pleasure. And combining erotica, classics, and science. You see, when I was looking at this kind of Hindi literature, there were so many books published, in this period in the early 20th century, which had words like Kam Shastra or Kok Shastra or Riti Shastra or Rati Kriya, and there was this constant fear expressed of being banned on charges of obscenity. And so most of these books camouflage themselves in the language of sexual science, claiming their authenticity by saying that they are focusing on scientific facts of sexual life. Now, many of them were actually quite didactic also at times in nature. They sometimes upheld normative modes of conduct, but at the same time, they made sex knowable to a Hindi reading public at a relatively cheap price. So what I'm saying is that while there is the censorship, such publications are also thriving and are being sustained by market forces, and they were embarrassing for the prudish and conservative elites, whether British or Indians, but they actually seem to have thrived at this time. There is a democratization of pleasure that is also taking place along with proscription. So I think that needs to be taken into account. Now let me quickly move on to the case of I don't know how much time do I have, but please, and I'll be grateful if 5 minutes before I'm supposed to end, if you can give me few.
You have time. It's okay.
Okay,
Continue.
okay, fine. So let me move to this kind of hate literature. We know amidst increasing sectarian conflicts and communal tensions in North India, particularly in the 90s, a lot of material was published in Hindi against Islam, Muslims, and Prophet Muhammad. Some of which escaped proscription, some of it which was banned for inciting hatred between Hindus and Muslims. Of course, Rangila Rasool, there are papers being presented on Rangila Rasool. But Rangila Rasool was banned in Urdu, but it also was translated into Hindi. There was Vichitra Jeevan in Hindi in the 1920s, which were caricatures of Prophet, by Arya Samaj, and they accused him of gross sensuality, of low sexual morals, and they reported brisk sales, and of course there were these celebrated court cases, against them. But in spite of being proscribed, as I said, Rangila Rasool went on to be translated and published in Hindi, and it continued to circulate, widely and clandestinely. There were a series of other publications in Hindi, that quite a few actually, which were proscribed for promoting communal hatred. So, for example, there was this handbill, it was written by Gopal Das, Shri Ayodhya Ji Ki Sachi Yatra, which again, was, constantly talking about how we need to protect our Gau Mata from Go Bhakshak Muslim Malechas. And, and similarly, there was this kind of poem titled, this Chand Musalmano Ki Harkatein, again, which, takes on, this kind of trope of how Hindu women are being abducted by Muslim men. There were also, this kind of pamphlet, which was called Stri Shiksha, which was proscribed, which was, which, basically retailed proper behavior for Hindu women. And what we see is, again, it was written by Shiv Sharma Mahopdeshak, who was a prominent Pandit and member of the Arya Samaj Pratinidhi Sabha in UP. And the pamphlet had these kind of detailed and minute instructions, to Hindu women, about to keep away from anything that is perceived as Islamic or from Muslim men and symbols associated with Muslims. So in some ways, what we see is the kind of increasing, how hate literature also comes under this kind of, category of proscriptions, and how the specter of illegibility was marked as Muslim, in a section of the Hindi literature. But I think what is equally important is, just like obscenity, hate writing too, elided any singular definition, because it included hurt sentiments, outrage, anger, discomfort, humiliation, insult. And what is again interesting is that even amidst various censorship, um, actually hate literature was also thriving, so no banning of print actually stopped incessant rumors or riots or construction of hate over women's bodies. So really, proscription is a failed enterprise. I don't think it actually works. It actually, even in terms of hate, I don't think so that proscription is any way or anywhere in any society the answer. So what has happens is that, but even amidst various censorships, the very fact that women were being given these instructions shows that there were cases where women were cutting across religious boundaries and they were defying community homogeneity. And here I also want to briefly touch on what Shahid was saying in the morning, how ostensibly and chiefly nationalist pamphlets, actually often portrayed the caste and communal biases of the times. So, for example, if you look at some of the publications around Swadeshi, how, there was this caricaturing of the Western Naib Sahib, or how women were constantly attacked for their fashion and dress in these kind of Swadeshi pamphlets, and they became a comment on sexual licentiousness, potent pleasures, and dangers of unbridled women. So, for example, there was this proscribed pamphlet called Gandhi Ki Dhoom Athwa Swadeshi Chanda, and one of the poems was like, विदेशी साड़ियां क्रेप की वो अधमलमल, हिंद के लोग गिरे देख उन्हें मुंह के बल, नारियां लाज से घूंघट न जो उठाती हैं, पहन के उनको साफ नंगी नजर आती हैं, डूब मरो तुम्हें लाज ना आती, पैसा और इज्जत दोनों गवा आती. Or, for example, again, links were drawn. There was this increasing use of Hindu vocabulary, which is visible in the proscribed publications. So, for example, Bral Krishna Vidyarthi is, he wrote this proscribed pamphlet called Swadeshi Prachar Mala. And again, a poem went, जूते आदि खाल के बनते, खून में कपड़े दे रंगवाए, गौ खून से रंगे वस्त्र को भारत में दे भिजवाए, चिकना चमकीला कपड़ा जो बाहर से भारत में आए, चर्बी की मंडी लगती है, तुमको सच सच दिया बताए. So there is this kind of, drawing on the kind of cow protection movement and drawing on those kind of idioms as well to buttress, the cause of nationalism. And now, quickly, my final snapshot, which talks about, communist literature. So, what we see is the Bolshevik Revolution. So there was this kind of the coming of the Bolshevik Revolution, which combined, with a new kind of mass turn in the in the freedom struggle, and with the advent of Gandhi, we also see alongside communist flowering in India, and there were, serious moves to actually suppress and proscribe communist publications. So, amidst this, we see that there were a whole range of progressive left intellectuals who emerged in the period, before Bhagat Singh, that Professor Chamanlal was talking about, figures like Radha Mohan Gokul, Ram Shankar Avasthi, Ganesh Shankar Vidyarthi, Satya Bhakt, who, created a communist Hindi print sphere. And again, what we see is that there was this kind of, banning, that takes place, at of this kind of literature. So, for example, I want to very briefly discuss some of the writings of this figure called Satya Bhakt, who many of which were banned at this time. And Satya Bhakt is a very interesting figure because he was the founder and organizer of the first Indian Communist Conference at Kanpur in December 1925, and he's been marginalized from mainstream left, but his writings really exemplify the inscriptions of actually a Hindu communist who brought on the same page, two unlikely ideological companions, which is Hinduism and Marxism. So, he's, Satya Bhakt talks of this pralay or ending. He gives this kind of apocalyptic warning about an end of colonialism. And how much time do I have?
I think it's just wind up, please,
Okay,
in
okay.
a minute or two.
Okay, I am going to. So what we see is that Satyabhat starts this, socialist, bookshop, which has, many of this is kind of showing the kind of, fear and the kind of publications on communism that were coming out and that were banned. So Satyabhat starts this socialist bookshop, which has a lot of proscribed publications. And what is interesting is that one of his books, which was called Agle, Sat Sal, which was, these are some of the books by Satyabhat which were banned. This was a book that was banned by the government, and on charges of saying that, it was basically, this book talked about catastrophes in between 1926 and 1931. And while this book was banned, there was this exactly a similar book by Satyabhat, which was called Samvat 2000, which escaped proscription. So exactly a similar book which escapes proscription. So just to conclude, I would say that these kind of discrete snapshots show that censorship and regulation in colonial India was often a failed enterprise, and that cultures of print were muddy and fluid, and they precluded the crafting of a master narrative of the censorship brigade. And as Devika Sethi has shown, in a fascinating work, there were great pleasures actually in reading banned books, and they were widely read. And what is also clear is that print material was banned not only by the state because it was perceived as seditious, obscene, or hateful, but also because of pressure, which was put from various constituencies within Indian identity politics. But as I've said, this kind of politics of proscription was constantly being subverted. There were perplexing and messy possibilities that the vernacular offered, which at times had this kind of liberatory potential. And this became the troubled site where divergent representations, around obscenity, hate, and communist writing came to be stage. So I think in the end, I would just say that I would lend my voice to the argument that no writing, including that which promotes hate, obscenity, or revolution, should be subject to legal regulation. Actually, I think what needs relentless combating is the context of religious caste, class, or gender subordination. Print can never be equated with physical action.